Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Fagan. I'm the director of the Human Rights Centre. I suppose you're wondering why I'm sat in my garden. I have a number of people living in this peculiar internet-dominated world that we're all occupying. I've got a number of internet connection issues, so I'm sat outside in a very lovely garden in rural France. I wish you could smell the jasmine that is just hovering above me because the smell is fantastic. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to actually turn my camera off before I introduce our speaker for this evening's Human Rights Centre annual lecture, given the internet issues that I am currently experiencing. I hope you can bear with us through these challenging times, as it were. Okay, so I'd like to begin by welcoming you to this evening's event, the 5th HRC annual lecture. During the pre-COVID age, this lecture was typically presented in person and to a lecture theatre of staff, students, and some members of the wider public. Of course, that was then, and we are where we are. I suspect that most of you are now accustomed to functioning in the Zoomverse and are looking forward to an engaging and thought-provoking lecture by our esteemed speaker. Professor Karima Bennoune holds the Homer G. Angelo and Anne Berryhill Endowed Chair in International Law and is a Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law at the University of California, Davis School of Law in the US. She has served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights since November 2015. During the academic year 21-22, she will be a visiting professor at the University of Michigan Law School. In 2017, she served as an expert in the reparations phase of the groundbreaking Al-Mahdi case before the International Criminal Court, concerning intentional destruction of cultural heritage in Mali. She is a former legal advisor for Amnesty International. Her field missions throughout her career have included Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Cyprus, Egypt, Lebanon, Mali, Malaysia, the Maldives, Niger, Pakistan, Poland, Serbia and Kosovo, and southern Thailand, Tunisia, and Tuvalu. Her academic publications have appeared in leading journals such as the AJIL, the Berkeley Journal of International Law, the Columbia Human Rights Law Review, the European Journal of International Law, and the Vanderbilt Journal of Transnational Law. While her topical pieces have been featured in outlets such as The Guardian, The Huffington Post, The New York Times, Open Democracy, and on Reuters. She's appeared widely in the international media, including on CNN, Fox Business News, MSNBC, Algerie Press Service, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, BBC Radio 4, France Couture, and Radio France International. Her book, Your Fatwa Does Not Apply Here, Untold Stories from the Fight Against Muslim Fundamentalism, which recounts the stories of people of Muslim heritage working against extremism, won the 2014 Dayton Literary Peace Prize. The TED Talk based on the book has been viewed by over 1.5 million people, a truly astonishing number. Professor Bennoune serves on the Scholar Advisory Board for Muslims for Progressive Values. In her most recent March 21 report to the UN Human Rights Council, Professor Bennoune warns that the pandemic may lead to a global cultural catastrophe with severe, long-lasting consequences for human rights if effective action is not taken immediately to guarantee cultural rights. Cultural rights are absolutely vital during a global health crisis. In fact, culture is the heart of our response to COVID-19. However, culture sectors have been amongst those hardest hit. For example, an entire generation of young artists may be forced to turn elsewhere by pandemic-related unemployment crises, diminishing cultural life for years to come. Hence, a cultural rights approach to the pandemic is essential. The cultural rights commitments of states under international law require them to take action so as to avoid catastrophe, but also to lead to cultural renewal as an essential component of any efforts to build back better. In this evening's lecture, entitled Preventing Cultural Catastrophe in the Pandemic, a Cultural Rights Approach, Professor Bennoune will discuss the ongoing implications of her March 2021 Human Rights Council report, provide a brief introduction to the work of the Cultural Rights Mandate, and share some reflections on the UN Special Procedure System as she prepares to conclude her mandate on October the 31st. Cultural rights, she will explain, are not a luxury, but are central to the human experience and critical for implementing other human rights and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. They are an integral part of the indivisible and interdependent framework of universal human rights, which should be given serious consideration by human rights advocates. It just remains for me to make a few technical points. Professor Bennoune is also experiencing some internet connection issues, and what we have done is to make a recording of her lecture as a backup in case the live version, which hopefully she will now be able to proceed to present, is disrupted in some way. We also have another backup, Plan B or Plan C if you prefer, in the form of my colleague Dr. Ahmed Shahid, who will stand in for me should I also experience any internet problems. So anyway, hopefully Professor Bennoune will be able to speak in a moment or two for 40 to 45 minutes. This will then be followed by a Q&A session, which provides an opportunity for you to raise questions and explore aspects of Professor Bennoune's lecture. You'll be able to raise your questions through the Q&A and chat functions throughout the course of the lecture, although it would be more convenient to me, the chair, for you to do so once Professor Bennoune has concluded her lecture. Okay, enough from me. Hopefully I haven't been speaking to a silence, and hopefully the connection has held for to this point. Professor Bennoune, welcome to the University of Essex. Great shame you haven't been able to join us, of course, in person, but delighted that you've been able to join us, albeit over these rather precarious connections. The floor and the audience now are all yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Good evening, good afternoon, and warm cultural solidarity to everyone. I'm really grateful to the Essex Human Rights Center for inviting me to give the annual lecture. I'm honored, and I'm also gratified by this recognition of cultural rights in such an august venue. I thank you all for attending, and I think we will shortly see emerging a human right not to spend too many hours of the day on Zoom. So I am very grateful to you for listening in these over-Zoomed times. I would be remiss if I didn't congratulate the England football fans and say how grateful I am that this lecture did not take place yesterday. I think that Dr. Shahid and I might have been alone in the Zoom room, and even he might not have attended. So very glad that this is happening today. I wanted to start out this evening's remarks with a joke, particularly one from the field of human rights, because it's been a long and serious year with many reasons to grieve. And I think we truly need to laugh. I began thinking about how to start a human rights speech with a joke in another non-funny time back in 2004, shortly after the Iraq War. I had to speak to a banquet audience that included Mary Robinson, who had just finished her term as High Commissioner for Human Rights. As you can imagine, I was nervous. Shortly before that speech, I attended a human rights meeting in Geneva. And after dinner one evening, I found myself walking with 3 Indian human rights activists, 2 professors of human rights law, one Welsh and one Scottish, and a Peruvian indigenous rights advocate. And I realize this may already sound like the sort of setup for a joke. And in fact, we actually did walk into a bar at one point in the evening, making it sound even more like a joke, but it's not. I told the transnational group of human rights proponents that I was going to speak at this dinner in front of Mary Robinson and asked them to share any human rights jokes that they might know for the occasion. For the first time since I met this very loquacious group, they fell silent. Finally, one of the Indian human rights defenders looked at me and seriously exclaimed, "Karima, I am fairly certain there are no human rights jokes." All the others agreed. So this was an international agreement. When I started to prepare that speech the following week, I tried to confirm this. Were there really no human rights jokes? As I began my search, I found many law jokes, but I couldn't find one website with human rights law jokes. Instead, I found a New York Inquirer piece about ill-fated attempts by then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to tell jokes in public, something which probably should have been a warning to me. And I also sadly located a reference to the arrests of Burmese comics by the junta. Some things really have not changed, but I turned up no actual human rights jokes. And as I found in the last few days while writing this speech, that still remains true. In fact, the very titles of those items that I did find back in 2004 suggest why there is such a dearth of jokes in the field. There is often little anyone feels it appropriate to joke about. But I ask myself, who could need humor more than human rights defenders? So as Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, I want to suggest that one useful thing the next generation of human rights lawyers being trained in places like Essex can do is to create a repository for human rights humor. And I regret to say that without such a resource currently available, I have no joke to start with this evening. Next slide, please. In all seriousness, Essex is one of the world's leading centers of learning about human rights. And so it's deeply meaningful to me and indicative of the progress cultural rights have made in the field that I have been asked to give this lecture. And Essex is also associated with the memory of the late Professor Nigel Rodley. And I have to say personally, as the daughter of a tortured survivor, Sir Nigel's work as Special Rapporteur on Torture inspired me. And I've never forgotten how kind he was to me in the early years of my career at Amnesty International, and I pay tribute to him today. Essex is also the home base of one of my highly esteemed co-conspirators as Special Rapporteur, Dr. Ahmed Shahid, who has been such a brilliant colleague, and this is yet another reason why I'm delighted to be giving this lecture. Next slide, please. In particular, I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to discuss my most recent report for the UN Human Rights Council, delivered in March of this year, on COVID-19 and cultural rights. This gives me an opportunity to think with you about the impacts of the pandemic and the measures taken to counter it on the exercise of cultural rights. First, however, I'm going to make a few introductory points about my work as Special Rapporteur, about the scope and nature of cultural rights, which may be less well known than other areas of human rights, and about their role in the broader universal human rights framework. And finally, the history and work of the cultural rights mandate. So those will be a few introductory points. As Special Rapporteur, I, like the others, write thematic reports. I carry out country missions, though that is mostly impossible at the moment due to the pandemic. And I can raise specific cases of allegations of violations of cultural rights, such as the arbitrary detention and reported torture of the Bangladeshi cartoonist Ahmed Kabir Kishore for 9 months during the pandemic, after his cartoons about COVID-19 were published online. Thankfully, after national and international advocacy, he is out and has returned to cartooning. I've also taken up cases concerning ongoing issues, such as the efforts to displace, in the name of development, London's Latin Village, the only Latin American cultural center in the UK. All of this work, reports, missions, and cases, is subject to limits of resources and capacity, which are considerable. Next slide, please. With regard to the nature and scope of cultural rights and their international legal basis, I note that the cultural rights mandate focuses in particular on the rights contained in Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 15 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which you see here. This covenant has 171 states parties, including the United Kingdom. Cultural rights include the right of everyone, and I stress everyone, to take part in cultural life without discrimination, the right to access and enjoy cultural heritage, the rights to artistic and scientific freedom, amongst others. The mandate also includes the right to benefit from scientific progress and its applications, which is especially relevant during the pandemic. Next slide, please. Cultural rights are core to the human experience. They have inherent importance for human dignity. They're about who we are. And they are also essential for implementing other universal human rights. They are not a luxury, even and perhaps especially during a global health crisis. In my work as Special Rapporteur, I have tried to demonstrate that cultural rights are a crucial part of responses to many current challenges, from discrimination to climate change, and most recently, COVID-19. Humanity restores and reimagines itself through creating and revising its cultural life. Cultural and artistic expressions have a strong transformative power and can influence the societies we live in. Artistic and cultural practices have been at the front line of resisting oppression and upholding the values of human rights and inclusion. Artists and cultural workers can and have, in many different contexts, played a leading role in responding to conflict and human rights abuses. In so doing, they give voice to others and act as cultural rights defenders. Those are human rights defenders who defend cultural rights in accordance with international standards, the subject of my 2020 report to the Human Rights Council. When cultural rights defenders undertake their work, they also often face risks, and their own human rights may need defense. With this very short introduction to cultural rights, now let me turn to the work and history of the UN's cultural rights mandate. 12 years ago, The debate at the UN over what were called traditional values burgeoned, led by Russia, which wanted to see the traditional values of humankind recognized as the basis for human rights law, without defining those values or recognizing that some of them have been deeply harmful to human rights at times. At the same time, genuine efforts to advocate for cultural rights within the universal human rights framework were advancing in civil society and in many countries around the world. And it was in this paradoxical environment that Cuba led the drive to create an independent expert on cultural rights in 2009, supported by many other states. Many cultural rights defenders were rightly elated. However, because of the political context and the gross misuse of claimed cultural excuses for many human rights violations, some other human rights defenders, especially women human rights defenders, were concerned. In any case, in a very positive development, the Pakistani feminist sociologist Farida Shahid, director of Shirkat Gah, a leading women's rights group, became the first independent expert on cultural rights in 2009, later upgraded to special rapporteur. She created a strong basis for the mandate's work within a context of the universal human rights framework, repudiating the traditional values approach. In her first mapping report, she stressed that cultures are constantly evolving, as are the concepts of human rights themselves, and that there is hardly any culture that has not at a given moment violated human rights. Furthermore, she noted that cultures are subjected to many internal debates and contestations. Next slide, please. Among her important thematic work, she produced reports on the cultural rights of women, on artistic freedom, and on the cultural rights aspects of intellectual property. I was appointed to succeed Farida Shahid and took up the post in November 2015, with my mandate continuing until the end of October of this year. That's 4 months left, not that I'm counting. In my thematic reports, I have studied a wide range of issues from a cultural rights perspective, as you see here, including cultural heritage and its intentional destruction, including the impact of diverse forms of fundamentalism and extremism, the relationship between universality and cultural diversity, the impact of the climate emergency, and my final report on cultural mixing, which is forthcoming. In fact, it's due in Geneva by the morning. A cross-cutting theme has been non-discrimination, with a particular emphasis on gender and disabilities as mandated by the Human Rights Council itself. I also have regularly recalled what cultural rights are not, and have seen that as a core part of my mission. Cultural rights are not tantamount to cultural relativism. They do not justify discrimination or violence. They are firmly embedded in the universal human rights framework, a term you'll hear me say again and again. Just like the challenges facing the mandate on freedom of religion or belief, as Dr. Shahid knows so well, I contend with the fact that some rights claims made in the cultural rights area are aimed at subverting the rights of others. I also have to campaign multidirectionally to counter, on the one hand, cultural relativists seeking to exploit the cultural rights framework, and on the other, universalists dismissive of any cultural rights claims because of the concern about potential for misuse. And this is a continuous balancing act. The Human Rights Council itself has regularly reiterated that cultural rights are an integral part of human rights, which are universal, indivisible, interrelated, and interdependent. In recent years, in part, I hope, due to the efforts of the mandate, cultural rights have gained in legitimacy. However, much remains to be done to fulfill the Council's vision. Even sometimes my colleagues working on other aspects of economic, social, and cultural rights that they often term economic and social rights forget about cultural rights. And as I always say, we have to make sure to put the C in ESC rights. Next slide, please. So with all of that by way of introduction, let me now turn to the specific question of the impact of COVID-19 and responses to it on cultural rights, artistic freedom, the work of cultural practitioners and cultural rights defenders. And this was, as mentioned, the topic of my last report to the Human Rights Council in March. I will survey the key messages of the report, assessing some of the negative impacts of the pandemic on cultural rights and the positive contributions of cultural rights to effective responses, in addition to noting a few key recommendations. But I must stress that I am unable to present the entirety of the report, and I think it's being shared with you in chat, or you can find it on the homepage of the mandate. COVID-19 is nothing less than a cataclysm for human rights and a foundational challenge to international human rights law. It is vital for the human rights response to be a holistic one, including by looking at civil and political, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights, and addressing both the human rights impacts of the virus itself and responses to it. In many contexts, marginalized groups who face structural inequalities have been disproportionately affected, while at the same time, the virus has also killed indiscriminately across all socioeconomic groups, ages, and identities. As I argued in an academic piece in the American Journal of International Law, this terrible dialectical reality of both the universal reach and the discriminatory impacts needs to be addressed as part of this holistic human rights analysis. Today, in fact, the global picture of the pandemic is very diverse. Some countries, as you know, are currently celebrating the reopening of cultural spaces and even allowing sort of fully packed football stadiums. But other regions, such as Southeast Asia, have recently been shutting down. And we're seeing ongoing tragedy in places like India. So in what some call, in some places, the late pandemic, but what is also the tragic height of the pandemic in other contexts, we try to look to and imagine the cultural future. Next slide, please. However, while we look to that future, we must also remember the accomplishments of the past, and we must grieve all those irreplaceable people we have lost in the cultural and artistic sectors around the world to COVID-19. Such as the Cameroonian Afro jazz legend Manu Dibango, and the chairman of the General Organization for Antiquities and Museums in Yemen, Mohamed El-Sayani, a bridge builder whose death created uncertainty about ongoing work to safeguard his country's heritage, and pioneering eco-feminist Jewish American artist Hélène Ailon, and Chinese film director Shang Kai, who passed away along with 3 family members at home in Wuhan, and Aurelia Jifichu from the Bora people in the Colombian Amazon region, an award-winning indigenous language teacher, to name, sadly, only a few. During the terrible second wave of the pandemic in India, many artists have been lost, countless, including Rajhan Mishra, who you see here, a 5th-generation classical musician and prize-winning vocalist who died in hospital due to a lack of ventilators. I pay tribute to all of them. It is essential to honor the memories of all of the 3.9 million who have died of COVID around the world, and arts and culture are a core element of how we do this. Those of us who work in the cultural fields must also ensure we document those who have fallen in the artistic and cultural sectors, in particular by memorializing their work and sharing it with younger generations so that it and their skills are not lost. But we must also memorialize them by supporting those who continue such artistic and cultural work and by promoting a nourishing cultural life for everyone. Next slide, please. My recent report warns that the pandemic may lead to an ongoing global cultural catastrophe with severe, long-lasting consequences for human rights if effective action is not taken immediately to guarantee cultural rights and to help cultural sectors recover. Now, there was a debate about the tone. Russia accused me and the Human Rights Council of using an alarmist tone because I used the word catastrophe. On the other hand, when I presented the report to the Swedish UNESCO committee, I was told that the catastrophe had already occurred, and so it wasn't a question of warning about it. And I think the situation is different in different contexts. Nevertheless, the consequences have already been very severe, almost everywhere. And so I really stand by my choice of the term catastrophe. But even as they are undermined, cultural rights are absolutely vital during a global health crisis. In fact, culture, as was mentioned in the introduction, is the heart of our response to COVID-19. With regard to the arts, the writer Stephen King tweeted, as you see here, "If you think artists are useless, try to spend your quarantine without music, books, poems, movies, and paintings." And this was fairly universal, though, in, of course, many different forms subject to people's resources and contexts, that people turn to a variety of forms of culture and cultural practice to cope with the pandemic. So this basic paradox emerged just at the moment when resort to the enjoyment of culture was increasing as a coping mechanism. When the meanings of cultural expressions were heightened, those who produce arts and culture were finding their work increasingly difficult. And what I really argue in the report is that urgent action was and remains needed to resolve this tension and guarantee the cultural rights of all. In fact, cultural sectors have been among those hardest hit, which I think really underscores why a cultural rights approach to the pandemic is essential. And as a professor of international law, it was important to me to remind states specifically that the cultural rights commitments they have under international law require them to take action so as to avoid cultural catastrophe and to recover where it has occurred, but also to lead to cultural renewal as an essential component of any efforts to build back better. Comprehensive global and national inventories of cultural rights effects should be carried out to inform the policies we need to achieve those goals and meet those legal requirements. Next slide, please. The economic crisis accompanying the pandemic has had disproportionate effects on cultural sectors and those who work in them. Arts workers and cultural practitioners are amongst those hardest hit by pandemic-related unemployment crises worldwide. And I express my solidarity, as I have again and again, with out-of-work artists and cultural workers everywhere. They must receive all necessary support, and that was the message, the core message I wanted to take to the Human Rights Council. Unfortunately, meanwhile, around the world, some states and private donors are substantially reducing their commitments to cultural sectors. And harmful impacts are sometimes magnified in developing countries where cultural infrastructures may be weaker. Moreover, all the pre-existing challenges associated with work in the artistic and cultural sectors, including the ongoing, that is, the underlying violations of cultural rights, compounded the pandemic effects. As one artist observed, every problem has been magnified. As you see here, the UNESCO Assistant Director General for Culture noted that the COVID-19 crisis has also revealed a persistent need for improved mechanisms to protect the social, economic, and working conditions of artists and cultural professionals. Additional problems such as increased financial insecurity and mental health impacts were added to the pre-existing challenges, creating a truly impossible situation for many. These developments have catalyzed a renewed debate about universal basic income for artists, which I think is a critically important discussion. Public health responses to the pandemic, which may be necessary and legitimate, and let me stress that the report fully supports effective science-based public health measures that comply with international standards. Still, these sort of lawful measures that were necessary may have had grave impacts on cultural rights, and those impacts must be addressed. For example, many public spaces vital for the enjoyment of cultural rights have been closed, potentially leading to permanent closures. It is important to consider the meaning of those losses in the lives of artists and cultural practitioners. In the words of a promising 25-year-old woman trumpet player in the UK, before lockdown, my career was taking off hugely. Since then, I had every single gig canceled. I have no clue as to when I'll start working again or what I can expect to make money from without losing the skills and playing standard I've built up until now. She reported that she did not benefit adequately from available government support because she had just begun her career. As her words indicate, artistic practices and skills also may be and have been lost as a result of these developments, and several generations of young adults, believing they have nowhere to go in the creative and cultural sectors, may be or have been forced to turn elsewhere. These are huge losses that could take years to recover from. The impact of all such developments is exacerbated by views in some countries, and you can tell me if this might sound familiar, which seem to blame the cultural sectors themselves or hold that work in the arts is somehow not real work, but a privilege. I was disappointed to hear reports of officials appearing to suggest that those working in the arts should simply get other jobs, and saddened to hear from many artists of being forced by economic circumstances to consider giving up their craft, which is first and foremost a loss for them, but a loss for their entire societies and for the cultural rights of everyone. The dignity and importance of creative work, and the rights to just and favorable conditions of work for those in the arts and culture sectors must be fully recognized. If they are denied their cultural rights and unable to do their work, everyone else's cultural rights are diminished. In the absence of adequate support, this will be and has been the entirely predictable result. Next slide, please. Moreover, there have been misuses of the justification of the pandemic as a cloak for violations of cultural rights and artistic freedom, with some governments exploiting emergency powers to censor and criminalize artists and cultural workers and cultural rights defenders with dissenting views. In the middle, very sadly, you see the picture of the very brave Bangladeshi writer Mushtaq Ahmed, who died in detention during the pandemic. He was detained due to his writings related to the pandemic. And my concern about imprisoned cultural rights defenders and artists heightened during the pandemic, with every such imprisonment possibly becoming a de facto death sentence due to the increased risk of contracting COVID-19 in detention. I think, for example, with great concern of Bakhtash Abtin, whose picture you see here, and unfortunately he represents many others. He is an Iranian poet and documentary filmmaker serving a 6-year sentence in Evin prison, and who reportedly contracted COVID in prison in April. He remains at great risk, and hundreds of other literary figures have called for his release. I reiterate my call for all those imprisoned for their artistic or cultural work to be immediately released, something which is even more urgent in the context of the COVID pandemic. Next slide, please. There have also been important gendered repercussions of the pandemic, which have had a grave impact on women's ability to take part in cultural life without discrimination. Yet there have been very few government measures specifically targeting gender equality in pandemic responses, including in responses to the cultural dimensions. All responses to the current cultural crisis must fully consider the cultural rights of women and their particular obstacles to enjoying those rights. And this is true for the recovery and post-pandemic phases as well. Next slide, please. There have been some positive developments during the pandemic in the field of cultural rights, including a digital revolution, at least for some of us, more about that in a moment, and the development, as you see here from India, of new performance and display models for sharing artistic and creative work. What will be essential going forward is to preserve and learn from what has been positive while effectively addressing the negative aspects. And that brings me to the next slide, please. Unfortunately, digital cultural opportunities have been undercut by the digital divide and also may have been limited based on disabilities or linguistic abilities. Hence, inclusion in and accessibility of cultural offerings must be emphasized in the cultural rights perspective. And as my fellow special rapporteurs have cited, it's a truly staggering statistic. 4 billion of the 7.8 billion people in the world, that's more than half, do not have regular access to the internet. So if you have Zoom fatigue, remember that is also a privilege. Next slide, please. During the pandemic, culture and cultural rights have been vital as means of delivering public health messages, supporting mental health, and overcoming isolation. We've seen sort of group chanting from windows in Wuhan. We've seen in Sicily sort of popular music jams on balconies so that people were safely isolated from each other. In my family, the digital concerts of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra have really been a lifeline. Many say that without culture, they would not have survived lockdowns. Artists and cultural workers around the world have tried to find ways to respond, including, for example, to this wave of the pandemic in India. And I was heartened to learn of an initiative, and you see some of the photographs here, called Art for India, in which artists from the UK, India, and the Indian diaspora and others donated work and held an online print sale to raise funds for COVID-19 relief and specifically to support Mission Oxygen. This is just one very small example. But unless adequate support, and I heard this message again and again, unless adequate support is provided to the cultural sectors, it will be impossible to fulfill all those vital roles in the pandemic and the post-pandemic going forward. This is not the time for cuts in culture funding, but for increases. And that was another key message I wanted to deliver to the Human Rights Council. I salute those states like Germany, which have allocated substantial additional funds for culture. Culture and arts funding and support for cultural workers should be integrated into all COVID-19 relief and stimulus packages. As not every state has the resources that Germany has, as not every state has adequate resources for what is needed in the crisis, solidarity, another word that I've been saying a lot lately, must also be extended internationally. And in the report, I called for consideration of the creation of a global cultural fund to support the recovery of cultural sectors around the world. Indeed, the core human rights values of solidarity and international cooperation are critical to all aspects of pandemic response and recovery in the cultural sectors and beyond. This, in my view, is a moment to creatively and vigorously implement Article 15.4 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which recognizes and stresses the benefits of cooperation in the scientific and cultural fields. Next slide, please. So to summarize the recommendations made in the report based on all of these issues that I've mentioned, I laid out a cultural rights-based framework for action in the face of the pandemic and the post-pandemic under the rubric that I hope would be easy to remember of cultures. C stands for consultation that is needed of all affected stakeholders and their participation in making policies to protect cultural life and rights in the pandemic. U is for the urgency of the response needed in funding and support for cultural sectors. L, again, is for legal obligation, a reminder that states are actually required to guarantee cultural rights. T is for 21st century, reminding us to take the long view. The choices we make now coming out of the pandemic or in the pandemic still about defending cultural rights will be defining of how these rights are enjoyed for years to come and whether they will be available to youth. The second U is again for upping the funding for culture. R is for rights-based approaches, and E stands for everyone, reminding us to maintain focus on inclusion and combat discrimination in the enjoyment of cultural rights, even in the current crises. And S finally, again, represents solidarity, a core human rights value we need now. Let me also say that as important as digital cultural life may have become where available, for example, enabling us to be together today, it is and must continue to be seen as a complement, not an alternative to a shared public cultural life in physical public spaces. We must commit to the full renaissance of that public cultural life when that becomes safe again in diverse contexts and in accordance with public health expertise. Future generations must not lose the opportunity to go to the theater or to the cinema or to browse in a bookshop. If they do, the pandemic will have not only killed and impoverished millions, but it will also have destroyed some of the best tools we have for imagining a better future after COVID, for working to prevent the next pandemic. It is essential for human rights advocates to affirm that we will not let that happen. And I hope that other human rights defenders will cooperate with cultural rights defenders to that end. And if you could kindly take the PowerPoint down now, I'm going to make a few concluding remarks about the human rights system as a whole within which this cultural rights work occurs. So Dr. Shahid asked me to reflect on the special procedures system that the cultural rights mandate is a part of. As I come to the end of my 6-year mandate, I just want to say a few words about this. When you become a UN Special Rapporteur, I think many people somehow think you've been handed a magic wand. And in fact, what you experience is that you've been given a toothpick with which to push a glacier uphill. That is really what it is like to be a Special Rapporteur in my experience. The challenges of having 2 full-time jobs, minimal staff of whom you are not the boss, an under-resourced human rights system and bureaucracy, which sometimes sees you as competition to be controlled rather than as a partner, and then facing constant ongoing violations with impunity for those violations. All of those challenges taken together are simply tremendous. However, there's an upside here too. The creativity and dedication of my fellow special procedures mandate holders, the commitment of our civil society partners, the resilience of victims and frontline human rights defenders with whom we work, and cooperation amongst all these sectors. And I have to stress the importance, this is a very collaborative enterprise. All of this can and does produce some positive results that can add up to change over time. Just to cite a few very small examples, I am very gratified by the release of some of the cultural rights defenders whose cases the mandate has taken up, such as the anti-slavery blogger Sheikh Mohammed Mekatir in Mauritania, who was released after relentless work by special procedures, including Dr. Shahid and myself, but I must stress in support of the lead role played by the heroic frontline human rights lawyers. I'm also glad to see that the UN General Assembly, in its recent resolution on attacks on religious sites, used language I had written plagiarized, but I'll say it more politely. I'm thrilled they did it. Used language from my cultural heritage report to condemn attacks on cultural heritage and specifically reference that can violate international human rights law. We have to celebrate these small victories, and they're important, but they are not enough. We need more resources to be given directly to mandate holders so that they can actually face up to these challenges in an effective way. We need those resources, again, given to them directly so that they do not disappear into the morass of the UN system. We also need to contemplate the possibility of a different kind of bureaucratic relationship between the special rapporteurs and the UN human rights bureaucracy. And I'm happy to talk about that more going forward in the discussion, a relationship which I think more fully centers the independence of the mandate holders and prioritizes the implementation of their visions. We need the communications capacity of the human rights system to be greatly enhanced, including through social media. We need more in terms of implementation and follow-up. We need, quite simply, to use 21st century tools to respond to 21st century problems like the pandemic. And I have to confess that with our dry 10,700 word reports with no graphics that come out 3 or 4 months after they are written, I sometimes feel as if we are operating in about 1986. It has been both a great honor and a profound learning experience, and a tremendous source of frustration and stress, quite frankly, to be a special rapporteur. A fully resourced special procedures system would be a tremendous asset in the fight for all human rights, including cultural rights, and it's something that I will continue to push for going forward as a professor of human rights law. We have many struggles to wage in the pandemic, but one of the most important, I think, is to hold on to hope and our ability to believe that we may change things for the better, including the human rights system itself. As serious as are the difficulties ahead, both in the field of human rights generally and in the context of the cultural crises occasioned by the pandemic, I want to end, as does my COVID-19 report, on a note of optimism. We need a vigilant optimism appropriate to our times, which recognizes the gravity of the challenges before us, but refuses to bow to them. As an Afghan woman human rights defender once told me, optimism is key to survival. As I hope is appropriate for the Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, I want to give the last word before our discussion to global artists whose eloquent notes during lockdown remind us that our cultural rights are vital for nourishing that collective life-sustaining hope. Thank you. And over to Catherine to show the 2 videos to end. And there may have been a technical glitch, in which case we can go to the discussion and maybe come back to the videos later.
Thank you, Karima. I'm going to keep my camera on for as long as it lasts. Thank you for such an incredibly impassioned defense of such a crucial area of human rights. As someone who's written and engaged with cultural rights, I obviously share all of your sentiments and the need to emphasize the culture in the economic, social, and cultural rights at that precise moment when the dog decides to bark at next door's dog. Don't work with kids or animals, clearly. Anyway, to my question. Thank you for the talk. Superb talk, addresses crucial issues. I'm sat here in France, in rural France, and one of the marked differences between France and the United Kingdom and the US, of course, is France's strong support, state support for the culture in an aesthetic sense rather than an anthropological sense. The anthropological sense is much more complex in this country, clearly. I wondered if you had a view or had engaged through your mandate with the commercialization of culture, the commodification of culture, and how that has prevented or provided some ostensive apparent justification for states' failure to support artists, particularly obviously during the pandemic, but much more broadly.
I think that that is a critically important concept to think about, and it's something that I'm thinking about a lot in my next report on cultural mixing and what impact, in fact, commodification of cultural mixing has on the whole debate about the issue and the impact that that has on the collective intellectual property rights of some, in particular, indigenous peoples. I've also tried to raise the issue of the commodification of culture and the need to also recognize the important role of public funding and public spaces. In a number of my reports. In the report that I did on public space, I looked in particular at the role that these spaces and free access to these spaces plays in actually guaranteeing everyone's ability to participate in cultural life. My predecessor also did a very important report on the impact of advertising and marketing practices on cultural rights, which I commend to you, which I think can answer your questions in much greater detail. And it's very interesting. In some countries, there isn't even a Ministry of Culture. The United States is one of those countries. There's been a whole debate about this now. And I recently was engaged in a debate with someone in an academic context who was very hostile to the whole idea of government involvement in the field of culture. And certainly there needs to be sort of guarantees of independence and processes that guarantee, funding streams that are independent and are not censoring particular voices. This is an issue that I raised when I went on mission to Poland. But the role, I think, of public funding and public spaces in cultural life is critically important. And I really salute those states that do provide a basic income to artists that enables them to live with dignity. I mean, we have young artists who are having serious health problems because they don't have health insurance, for example. So this is an issue. Artistic freedom is not only guaranteed by the absence of censorship. It's not only a civil and political right. It is also an economic, social, and cultural right that depends on the right to work and the right to decent conditions of work for artists. So thank you very much for this question.
Thank you, Karima, and for allowing me chair's prerogative or privileges. We have questions coming in from the audience. I'm going to take 2 or 3 and present them to you. Here's one from anonymous but signs herself Beatriz Barrero, University of Rey, Juan Carlos, Madrid. Thanks so much to the Special Rapporteur. I also find the word catastrophe very accurate. Also taking into account the temptation to do recovery from pandemic, the back to normality, using the former parameters. In this sense, the Agenda 2030, with which the Special Rapporteur is also engaged, appears to be valuable. Maybe some findings discovered during the pandemic, for instance, the possibility of stabilizing 4 working days a week, could make human life more sustainable, something that finally is also cultural. Where do you see cultural rights from this perspective in the following months and years? And one more question for the moment from Giza. Given the fundamental challenges to the Special Rapporteur mandate that you just mentioned, how do you recommend civil society can support the adequate expansion and adequate resourcing of the Special Rapporteur cultural rights mandate? Two large, meaty, I say that as a vegetarian, but 2 large, meaty questions.
Thank you very much for these questions. And let me start with the civil society question. I could not have done many of the things that I've been able to do without the support of civil society. Civil society has been an incredibly important partner of the cultural rights mandate. One of the challenges in the special procedures system is that all special procedures are economically not equal. Some have this goes back to the issue about commodification perhaps, but some have access to much greater financial resources than others do because they get much greater donations from states. So when you're sort of one of the perhaps more towards the poorer end mandates, having those civil society partners to enable you to do the work is critical. I think about, for example, there is no budget, believe it or not, for the Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights to attend the annual Commission on the Status of Women of the UN in New York, when the Human Rights Council itself has identified that gender and discrimination on the basis of gender are sort of a key priority issue for the mandate. Civil society enabled me to attend the CSW. The same thing was true of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples. I was not able, I don't have a budget to attend that, but thanks to an academic institution, I was able to do so 1 year. So I would say for those civil society organizations that do have financial resources, those kinds of supports to the mandate are incredibly important. I've also called in the 10th anniversary report for the mandate back in 2019 for, and it's not for me to tell civil society what to do, but for civil society to consider the possibility of creating a coalition for cultural rights at the UN, similar to the Coalition for Freedom of Religion or Belief that works very closely with Ahmed Shahid, and to make sure that those sort of defenders of cultural rights are always being heard in the UN system, to increase the submission of cases to the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and other relevant bodies related to cultural rights, so that we can build up the jurisprudence to lobby in support of cultural rights, and maybe some of the things we might need in the future, such as a possible resolution on cultural rights defenders going forward. I think all of that is very important. And I think also kindly remembering the limited resources of the Special Rapporteur, and sort of to paraphrase, you know, the well-known expression, ask not what your Special Rapporteur can do for you, but what you can do for your Special Rapporteur. Finding for my successor, whatever, whoever is chosen, when you ask of them something, always see what you can also offer to enhance the mandate's work, and finding ways to publicize it, including through the use of creative and artistic tools. You know, we write these reports. I've got a copy of the COVID report here. It looks something like this. As you can see, this is not terribly inspiring to maybe perhaps especially to young people. So helping the Special Rapporteur find ways to translate this, including artistic and cultural modes of transmission of the key messages of a report like this. I think that that is critically important. Developing toolkits to help to implement the recommendations of those reports. I think that all of those are some very important ideas. And I'm very eager to hear also suggestions that others have, but those are some suggestions based on my experience. And back to the first question, I'm glad that the questioner agrees with the use of the term catastrophe, although I'm of course sad that that seems like the correct word. But again, remember, we're thinking about a world where at one point, you know, most of the cultural institutions and most of the schools in many places were closed all at once for a protracted period of time. I think that, and you know, necessarily so, but I think that does constitute a catastrophe. In any case, I really take the point of this questioner about not needing to build back to normality. We're not building backwards, we're building forwards. And I do think that Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals can be a key piece of that, if we continue to make sure that the discourse about sustainable development goals is a discourse infused by human rights, culture, and accountability. And sometimes, unfortunately, in the UN system, I'm seeing the development discourse used as an alternative to those things by some states because they're more comfortable. But the kind of, you know, very integrated approach that we see, for example, in instruments like the Rome Charter, which is a civil society instrument addressing these very issues, can help us to think about using the sustainable development approach, informed by the cultural rights approach, to build forward rather than back. And as I said, you know, to think about how we preserve what we have learned how to do better during the pandemic, such as sort of delivering culture through the internet to those who have access, while thinking about all the accessibility issues, thinking about how we preserve some of the creative performance models that we have, thinking about how we maintain some of the increases in culture funding that we have seen in some places. But of course, elsewhere, really what we're having to fight against is cutbacks. But I appreciate very much the optimistic view of this questioner. And I think, this issue of sort of cultural and human sustainability around things like 4-day work weeks, something I certainly personally would support very much, but we're going to need to use culture to reframe those discussions to build a popular consensus in favor of those sorts of changes. And here again, I think we see the importance of cultural rights and cultural spaces. So thanks very much for those questions. And I see there's 12 new messages in the chat, so maybe I better stop answering those questions and see what else is being asked.
Thank you. Thank you again for making such a compelling case for cultural rights as the linchpin of so many challenges that we face at the moment. Can you hear me?
I'm so sorry that I missed most of the first half of what you said, and the problem may have been on my end.
No, I think the problem is on my end, actually, Karima. It may be the moment for you to step in, if you may, and continue raising questions, setting questions for Karima, if that's okay. I've got a poor connection here.
Right. Okay. Super. Thank you. Right. Karima, good to see you. I just heard from our control that the videos you wanted shown can now be shown. Is it okay to proceed on that basis before we get to questions again?
Absolutely, or it's entirely up to you. We could finish the questions and end with those. It's as you prefer. I'm fine either way.
Okay, I think while the system holds, I think we can have the video shared, then we can come back to the Q&A.
Excellent. Well, again, these are examples of artists finding ways to transcend isolation and to try to really raise morale during the pandemic. And you see these happening around the world. And I wanted to share them first from Lebanon and then from the Netherlands.
Great. Okay, we'll have them now. Thank you. Catherine?
بنت الشلبية عيونها لوزية بحبك من قلبي يا قلبي وانتي عينيا بحبك من قلبي يا قلبي وانتي عينيا شلبية 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 تحت القناطر محبوبين قناطر كسر الخواطر يا ولفي ما هان عليا كسر الخواطر يا ولفي ما هان عليا ترارم 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 ترارم.
And that again is just a reminder of some of the amazing creative work that was done around the world to keep us all going in this last surreal year and a half.
Great, thank you so much. If I may continue with the question, got a whole series of questions on the Q&A now. Let's read them as they've come in. The next one is from Barbara Aziz. She's asking about the evaluation by a mandate of sanctions against Syria, Cuba, and Venezuela, to name three among many. And the question she has is, what have the mandate got to say about these US designed sanctions and the cultural vitality of those countries? In other words, the impact of the sanctions on cultural vitality of countries which face these sanctions. That is one question. The other is, I think you've already responded to these recommendations for how civil society can engage, but the further question about, given that the right embraces such a large spectrum from right to benefit from scientific progress, cultural rights, defenders, and so on and so forth, how do you, what recommendations do you have for society activists working on the separate parts of cultural rights, given the broad spectrum of this right? So given the breadth of the spectrum, what recommendations do you make for people working in this field? The next question from Dr. Judith Benedict from Essex University, I think. In the UK, the COVID restrictions are being rapidly abandoned. This will provide both relief to, but also risk to the cultural sector, including performers. A particular point of contestation is the relaxing of isolation and face masks requirements. Your framework you presented may help negotiate this challenge in the arts sector. Could you say a little more about it? Can lessons be learned from elsewhere? And of course, she thanks you for your presentation and so on. Then, yeah, I think we'll end there and then we take the next ones once we have a chance to go through them. Over to you, Professor Bennoune.
Great. Thank you so much for these questions. And let me start with the last one first. This is such a critically important issue. And in fact, in the report, I say that the cultural rights and the right to benefit from science really go hand in hand here, because the only way we can really return to a full public cultural life, the only way we can have safe conditions for doing that for the public and for artists and cultural workers themselves, is to do so according to the science. This is critically important. And so I was really at pains to say again and again in the report that we need to accept legitimate constraints on cultural rights, such as the closing of some cultural institutions, if that's done in accordance with the international standards on limitations on rights, by law in a democratic society, transparently on the basis of the science and so on. And that opening up too fast, as the questioner stresses rightly, is a risk to everyone, to the public and future public confidence about going into such spaces, as well as to the performers. I think the role of the unions of artists has been critically important, and the labor rights of artists. I talked about economic rights, but I want to talk specifically the labor rights of artists are an incredibly important piece of this. One of the things that I talked about in the report was trying to build links between the culture sector and the public health sector, so that you would have sort of built-in channels between, say, the Ministry of Culture and the health ministry in a particular country. And I know this is difficult because there's so many demands right now, but also building links between experts in the public health field and the cultural field, so as to figure out safe ways of doing this. There was an amazing sort of effort that was done again in the city of Detroit, where the opera actually performed in a parking garage. I mean, that sort of raises all sorts of limitations for people who don't have cars and so on, but just a very interesting creative model. There was also some very interesting work done in Germany trying to study how you can hold public events, how you can hold concerts safely. I think we need more of that research to be done. That needs to be invested in, and we need to follow that science. That is critically important. I'm a very big supporter of masks. I still absolutely wear a mask indoors. I am following the advice of the World Health Organization on this one. And I think the cultural sector can play a big role actually in shifting the discussion around masking away from a political discussion, which it has become in some places, and back towards an evidence-based discussion. And we've seen cultural and sports and other figures try to play a role in making sure that this happens. So much more could be said, but sorry, I want to get on to the other questions. What should civil society do? What should cultural rights defenders do in the cultural rights area? when the topic is so broad. And I have to say, I'm very sympathetic to asking this question, because this is a question that I myself faced as special rapporteur. You know, I'm looking at this incredibly broad mandate. When I go on mission to a country, I have to speak to many different ministries, for example, you know, education, the culture ministry where there is one, many ministries dealing with specific groups, women and the family and persons with disabilities, and so on. The mandate is incredibly broad, sometimes to talk to religious officials as well, because there's overlap there. So I've had to make very strategic choices about where to focus. And I respect different choices that are made. That, you know, some groups really want to focus on the cultural rights of Indigenous peoples. Some groups really want to focus on the cultural rights of women or of a particular minority group. Some focus on, say, language rights, or some focus on cultural heritage. And I think that that's very appropriate. What we need, and I again go back to this coalition idea, is to build more bridges amongst those areas of civil society that are working on different aspects of cultural rights, which is why that coalition is so important. With regard to many other human rights covered by special procedures mandates, there's sort of much more coherence. There might be one or a few constituencies, but here we're talking really about finding a way to increase our strength and amplify our voice by bringing these diverse constituencies together, the librarians, the archivists. I mean, it is a very broad group. And I hope that there can be some international gatherings of cultural rights defenders across all of these frontiers to enhance their work together. And finally, I'll say, with regard to sanctions, I'm certain that that's a very important question. I myself have not had the opportunity to look at that specific issue, but there is an entire mandate, a special procedures, a mandate holder tasked with looking at the impact of sanctions. And I certainly hope that that person can and will look at the cultural dimensions going forward. So thank you for that question too.
Thank you. Can I take a few more questions, Karima?
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you. A couple from Professor Matthew Wynot, University of Delaware. I have two questions, if I may, one substantive, one procedural. The first, might you elaborate on the relationship between cultural rights and dignity? And the second, how do you settle on the subject of your thematic reports? Is the decision entirely yours? That's Matthew Wynot's questions. I have just take perhaps one more in this round from Professor Michael Freeman. He says, some people are concerned that the so-called culture wars, including conflicting responses to the coronavirus pandemic, are weakening commitments to democracy. Can the human rights approach to culture help to solve this problem?
Oh, thank you for three more very rich questions, and I will try to answer them quickly as our time winds down, but they're all questions deserving of very long answers. Let me take the culture wars question first. I think one can define culture wars in different ways. We've seen different manifestations of this in different regions. And I think they all sort of have the central theme of seeing the pandemic not as a moment when we sort of face the stark choice that Wolfgang Friedman wrote about, to cooperate or perish, but instead as an opportunity to divide people further, regardless of the public health and human rights consequences of doing so. We've seen this in the United States with regard to the politicization of masking and vaccines. And some of the very powerful voices actually countering that have been from the fields of culture and sports and leisure. I think about the country music legend Dolly Parton tweeting herself being vaccinated and about her support for vaccination. She can reach a public that cannot be reached necessarily by public health officials. So that is one kind of example. I also think of, in terms of culture wars related to the pandemic, and it's something I didn't have space to talk as much about in the report as I would like to have, and there's also another rapporteur on minorities, but I was very concerned about the cultural rights impact of the targeting of minorities in relation to the pandemic, such as the use of discriminatory terms. And I apologize that just to use these terms, to give you an example, they're awful terms. So in Pakistan, it was reported to me that the term Shia virus was sometimes used to refer to COVID-19, referencing Shia pilgrims who returned from Iran and were blamed for having brought the virus with them, and who were reportedly treated very differently in quarantine than others returning to the country at that time, or the terrible use of really discriminatory terms by the former president of the United States related to China and Asia. And this really coincided with a terrible rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans. I think this is clearly another manifestation of the culture wars related to the pandemic. And here again, I think we see that arts and culture have been key in creating a space for exposing people to a diversity of voices and countering the stereotypes that are pervaded by that sort of language. And there have been many artistic responses such as those involving minority artists that were recently organized by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights Minority Fellows. But the challenge is how we figure out ways to make the microphone of those countering the hate through arts and culture, to make that microphone a louder microphone than that of those purveying the hate. And that's where funding for culture and support for the cultural sectors is critically important in enabling them to do that work. I mean, I could talk about many other things. There's the whole issue of the rejection of science, the misuse of religious or cultural arguments or tradition or superstition to try to convince people to disregard scientific arguments about COVID-19, and I gave a number of examples of this in my report. There's another set of issues that I raised that I was deeply concerned about, which is these sorts of culture wars related to science and health, resulting ultimately in attacks in some places on healthcare workers and attacks on public health officials, which is a matter of really grave concern. And I should stress there's also been wonderful acts of support for healthcare workers, I know, including in the UK, but then these incidents of violence around the world have been very worrying. And here I tried to recommend and emphasize in the report the need to depoliticize the scientific response to the pandemic and to focus on fact-based and evidence-based policymaking, but to go further back to really recognize that this part of the culture wars was really the direct result of insufficient scientific and public health education and undermining of commitments to fact-based and evidence-based public discourse, which has to be addressed through culture and science education going forward. So I'm sorry, that was a very long answer, but that is such an important question. So how do I choose the topic of my annual reports? I sort of laugh at this question because it really relates back to the other question about working across different fields within cultural rights. It is sometimes very difficult, and there are many reports I wish that I could have done. Mandate needs to do a report on the cultural rights of Indigenous peoples. I've done a lot of work, including in my report on climate change, including in a recent amicus brief on those issues, but there isn't a dedicated report. There also needs to be a dedicated report on cultural rights and sustainable development, and or it could be framed in the SDGs. I wish that that could also be done. And there needs to be a report on the cultural rights of the persons with disabilities, perhaps done in tandem with the relevant mandate, but I just didn't have time to get there. What I tried to pick were issues that seemed to me to be extremely urgent at the time, or to offer a moment of opportunity. So my first reports on cultural heritage came about because when I became Special Rapporteur, we had just seen the terrible destructions at Palmyra. And there was a moment when the international community was suddenly interested in this issue, and I wanted to use that moment both to reflect on that particular model of cultural heritage destruction, but to raise other forms of cultural heritage destruction, such as systematic destruction in the past of the cultural heritage of Indigenous peoples in settler colonial states. Excuse me, so I tried to use that moment of opportunity in that way. Or I've tried to raise issues that seem to be a particular challenge to human rights and cultural rights at the time, such as fundamentalism and extremism back in 2017. And finally, cultural mixing is a topic that I've taken up, and mixed cultural identities, because it's an issue that I've encountered on mission in so many places around the world. And I've encountered it in the UN halls, where states often talk about their culture, and I'm generalizing, not all states do this, but some states talk about culture as one thing of which somehow they are the guardian. There is one national culture of which they are the guardian and for whom they speak. And this kind of erasure of the multiplicity and hybridity of culture. And I have seen this on the ground again and again. And I've also seen the wonderful possibilities when people come together to defend the culture and heritage of others, and to really recognize the hybridity and multiplicity of our cultural tradition. So I was very inspired by that and wanted to take up that issue. And excuse me. Finally, on cultural rights and dignity, this is, I think, a critically important thing to understand, and I hope can be a key component of any future report on cultural rights and sustainable development. And again, this goes back to the idea of recognizing cultures, and I always prefer the S, cultures and cultural rights, as not being luxuries, but as being really core to who we are, how we understand ourselves, our world visions, our, as the phrase is often used, our cosmovisions. You know, it's really, culture is really sort of food for the human spirit. It is essential. It is a necessity. And just because my voice is giving out, I'll stop there and see if there are other questions, but much more to be said about that.
Great, thank you. That implies to me that I can ask one more question of you.
Yes.
I know that you've been demanding 2 hours of your time, because you also did a recording for us earlier to make sure there was a backup in case there was a problem with the connection. But it's really, I think, good question in UK context. It says, here it is. Here in the UK, the periodic review process of the IESCR, the Covenant, is happening now, and I believe it goes before the committee in early 2023. So now is the time for the cultural sector to prepare its shadow reports. The question is, how much attention is given cultural rights by the committee? And is this an underused opportunity for cultural rights organizations in the UK to lobby against cuts in funding? As we know, the government will be looking to justify cuts as part of its post-pandemic recovery strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question, and I will do my best. My allergies are kicking, excuse me, kicking in. I think that is incredibly important to really focus the attention of the committee on Article 15 of the Covenant. That is the article that guarantees cultural rights and is always considered on the last day of the session, which means inevitably time is running out, and not that many cultural rights defenders, excuse me, submit information. So I encourage you to do that, and any way I can support that process, I would be happy to do. And I think my voice is shutting down, so my apologies for that, but thank you sincerely.
Well, thank you so much, Karima, for that excellent lecture, and also for responding to the questions in so much detail and so thoughtfully. I do think Director Andrew Fagan is able to be back online. Yep, there you are. So over to you. Thank you.
Karima, thank you. Ahmed, thank you so much for covering for me, dropping out. My mobile phone was down to 1 bar. Hopefully it will just bear out just as long as Karima's voice bears out for the last moments. Apologies to all of those who raised questions and we weren't able to get to them. I hope you understand, of course, that so many remarkable topics and issues that Karima's excellent lecture has raised really results inevitably in areas that we won't be able to explore in this particular moment. I'm sure there is huge opportunity for future work, ongoing and future work in this area. Karima, thank you so much again on behalf of the entire Human Rights Centre community for agreeing to present this particular lecture. The annual lecture marks the culmination of a highlight of our year, and the culmination to a certain extent really of our activities throughout this particular year. At that moment the dog starts again. It's classic. So Karima, thank you so much. Thank you on behalf of the entire Human Rights Centre community. Thank you for presenting such a superb lecture and for providing such frank, because often these are very difficult areas, such frank responses to so many excellent questions. I'd like to also thank Catherine Freeman and Sophie Conlon, who are behind the scenes and have provided superb and, as ever, essential technical support, particularly in these issues and connection issues we've been experiencing. I'd also like to thank Ahmed Shahid, of course, my colleague, for stepping in to cover for me in this moment. Karima, thank you. I wish you a pleasant retirement, as it were, from your role. I hear you very loudly. I'm sure we all hear you very loudly. It's astonishingly, it's a labor of love, clearly, that's not always fully recognized. In fact, is it hardly ever recognized fully? Thank you so much. It just remains for me to say thank you to the audience. Thank you for sparing your time, giving up your time with us, and bearing technical issues. Karima, thank you. Take care. Look forward to speaking again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.